They say courage is the absence of fear. They're wrong. I learned this truth in the smoking ruins of Kepler Station, watching a human soldier named Sarah Martinez drag her wounded comrade to safety while plasma, fire melted the walls around her. Her hands shook, sweat poured down her face, and I could smell the terror radiating from her skin. Yet she never stopped moving forward. I am Zeth Carey of the Valerian Guard, engineered for war from birth. My species conquered 17 star systems before humanity even discovered fire. We pride ourselves on our fearlessness, our perfect tactical minds, our unwavering resolve in battle. For 3 centuries, I believed fear was weakness, a flaw to be eliminated. Then, the Void Swarm came for us all. What I witnessed fighting alongside humans didn't just change my understanding of courage. It revealed a terror so profound, so fundamentally alien to everything I thought I knew about existence, that it shattered the very foundations of what I believed possible. This is the story of how humanity taught me that sometimes the greatest bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's what you choose to do when fear is all you have left. And why, even now, safe in my quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel Unity's Promise, I still wake screaming in the dark. Zeth Carey's plasma rifle hummed with deadly energy as he crouched behind the twisted remains of what had once been a cargo transport. The acrid smell of melted metal and burned flesh filled his respiratory chambers, a combination that would have sent most species into shock. Not the Valorians. They had been bred for this, engineered over millennia to be the perfect warriors. Fear was not in their genetic code. The Kepler Station's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows. What had been humanity's most advanced research facility just 6 hours ago now resembled the aftermath of some cosmic nightmare. Walls had been torn apart not by weapons, but by something far worse. The metal looked like it had been dissolved from the inside, leaving behind patterns that hurt to look at directly. Contact bearing 270, came the clipped voice of Commander Hayes through the comm system. The human's voice carried none of the steady calm that Zeth Carey expected from a seasoned military leader. Instead, there was something else, a tremor that spoke of barely contained terror. Zeth Carey adjusted his position and peered around the debris. Through his enhanced vision, he could see the humans of Delta Squad moving with practiced precision through the station's central corridor. Their movements were efficient, professional, but wrong somehow. Where Valerian soldiers moved with the fluid grace of apex predators, these humans seemed to fight against their own instincts with every step. The first human he focused on was Sergeant Martinez, a compact woman with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her pulse rifle was steady in her hands, but Zeth Carey's thermal sensors picked up the rapid beating of her heart and the elevated heat signature that indicated extreme stress. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the station's cool atmosphere. "I don't understand it," Zeth Carey muttered into his comm, speaking in a human's language with only a slight accent. They moved forward despite obvious physiological indicators of terror. How do they function with such compromised neural states? Captain Thorne, his Valerian commander, responded through their private channel. "Humans are defective, Zeth Carey. Their fear response interferes with combat efficiency. Observe them, but do not expect rational behavior." But as Zeth Carey watched, something happened that challenged everything he thought he knew about human psychology. A sound echoed through the station, not heard but felt. It vibrated through the deck, plating, and into their bones, a frequency that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and speak directly to the primitive brain. It was the sound the Void Swarm made when it fed. Every human in the corridor froze. Zeth Carey watched their faces through his scope, seeing expressions of pure, primal horror. Private Chun, barely out of training by human standards, actually dropped his weapon. His hand shook so violently that he couldn't retrieve it from the deck plating. This was what Zeth Carey thought. This was where human weakness would finally show itself fully. They would break, scatter, perhaps even flee entirely. He had seen it happen with other species when faced with the swarm's psychological warfare. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Sergeant Martinez was the first to move. Despite the terror written across her face, despite the way her breath came in short, sharp gasps, she stepped forward. "Chun," she said, her voice steady even though her body betrayed her fear. "Pick up your weapon, soldier." "I can't," Chun whispered, staring at his trembling hands. "Sarge, I can't make them stop shaking." Martinez walked over to the young soldier and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need them to stop shaking," she said quietly. "You just need them to hold your rifle." She helped him retrieve his weapon, and though his hands continued to tremble, he managed to grip it properly. Around them, the other humans were performing similar acts of what? Zeth Carey struggled to find the word. Among the Valorians, fear was eliminated through genetic modification and psychological conditioning. This was something else entirely. Moving forward, Commander Hayes announced, "Stay tight, stay focused. Remember your training." The sound came again, closer this time, and with it came something that made Zeth Carey's genetically modified nervous system finally react with something approaching alarm. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on an oily quality that made reality appear to bend and twist at the edges of vision. This was the swarm's true weapon. Not their physical forms, but their ability to make existence itself feel wrong. Through his scope, Zeth Carey watched Private Chun take a step forward, then another. The young human was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he advanced toward the source of the sound. Behind him, Sergeant Martinez provided steady encouragement. "That's it, Chun. One foot in front of the other. We got your back." "But, Sarge," Chen's voice cracked. "What if we don't make it? What if those things get us?" Martinez was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her words sent a chill through Zeth Carey's engineered consciousness. "Then, we make sure they pay for it." The corridor ahead opened into the station's main laboratory complex. The doors had been torn away, and beyond them, the air shimmered with that same reality-distorting effect. Emergency lighting flickered and died as they approached, leaving only the eerie bioluminescence that the void swarm creatures emitted. "Multiple contacts," reported Corporal Jackson, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Can't get a solid count. They're doing that thing again." Zeth Carey knew what that thing was. The void swarm didn't just exist in 3 dimensions. They could partially phase into what human scientists theoretically called higher dimensional space, making them appear and disappear in ways that violated everything sentient species understood about physics. Watching them move was like trying to focus on something that existed in the corner of your vision. The moment you looked directly at it, it seemed to slip away. "Weapons free," Commander Hayes ordered. "Engage on sight." The humans spread out in a standard tactical formation, but Zeth Carey could see how the formation was subtly modified. Where a Valerian squad would have taken the most efficient positions for maximizing firepower, the humans had arranged themselves so that no one was ever completely alone. Each soldier could see at least 2 others at all times. The first swarm creature materialized at the laboratory's far end, and Zeth Carey felt his enhanced vision struggle to process what he was seeing. The thing was roughly the size of a human, but its form seemed to constantly shift between dimensions. Parts of it would be solid and visible one moment, then fade into translucency the next. Its surface wasn't quite skin wasn't quite metal, but something that hurt to look at directly. When it moved, it didn't walk or crawl. It simply transitioned from one position to another, reality bending around it like water around a stone. Most disturbing of all were its eyes, if they could be called eyes. They were holes in space itself, windows into some cosmic darkness that seemed to go on forever. The humans opened fire immediately. Their plasma rifles lit up the corridor with blue-white death, but the swarm creature barely seemed to notice. The energy bolts passed through its partially phased body without effect. "Solid rounds," Martinez shouted. "Switch to kinetic." The squad's weapons reconfigured themselves with practiced efficiency, and suddenly, the laboratory filled with the sharp crack of supersonic projectiles. These seemed to have more effect. The creature flickered and reformed several meters away, its impossible anatomy showing signs of damage. But it wasn't alone. More creatures began to phase into existence throughout the laboratory. Zethkari counted 6, then 12, then lost track as they began to overlap and merge in ways that made his enhanced visual processing systems issue warning alerts. The air filled with that terrible sound again, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a sensation like ice-cold fingers reaching directly into the mind. This was the swarm's true horror. They didn't just kill, they infected consciousness itself, spreading a kind of existential dread that made their victims question the very nature of reality. Zethkari had read the reports from other worlds that had fallen to the swarm. Survivors spoke of a fear so profound that it continued long after the physical threat had passed, a terror that made them unable to trust their own perceptions. And now he was watching humans walk directly into it. Private Chun was the first to be targeted. One of the creatures appeared directly behind him, its not quite solid form reaching out with appendages that existed in too many dimensions at once. The young soldier spun around, and Zethkari saw his face go white with absolute terror. But he didn't run. Instead, he raised his weapon and fired point-blank into the creature's center mass. The kinetic rounds tore through its partially phased body, causing it to flicker and retreat several steps. "Good shooting, Chun," Martinez called out as she engaged 2 more creatures that had appeared near the laboratory's main console. "Keep them back from the databanks." The battle quickly devolved into a nightmare of impossible geometry and physics-defying movement. The swarm creatures phased in and out of reality, attacking for directions that shouldn't exist while that horrible sound continued to batter at the humans' minds. Zethkari watched in fascination as soldier after soldier was faced with terror that should have broken their will entirely. Yet they kept fighting. Corporal Jackson had tears streaming down his face as he laid down, suppressing fire on a cluster of creatures trying to flank their position. His aim was steady despite his obvious terror. When his weapon overheated, he switched to grenades without hesitation, lobbing high-explosive charges into spaces where reality itself seemed uncertain. Commander Hayes coordinated the squad's movements with clipped, professional commands. Even as sweat poured down his face, and his hands shook visibly on his weapon's grip. When one of the creatures managed to partially materialize inside their defensive perimeter, he didn't hesitate to engage it in close quarters, using the stock of his rifle to club at its shifting form. But it was Sergeant Martinez who truly confounded Zethkari's understanding. She had positioned herself at the most dangerous point in their formation, the gap between the main laboratory and a secondary corridor where creatures could approach unseen. As she fought, she maintained constant communication with her squad, offering encouragement and tactical updates. "Contact left, Chun. 2 more coming through the wall. Jackson, reload and cover the right flank. Hayes, we need to fall back to secondary positions in 30 seconds, all while engaging multiple enemies that existed partially outside normal space-time. The creatures pressed their attack, and gradually Zethkari began to understand something about human tactics that his species had missed entirely. The Valorians fought with perfect coordination because they had been engineered to suppress individual initiative in favor of collective efficiency. Humans fought with coordination despite their individual fears, each soldier making conscious choices to trust and support their comrades even when their instincts screamed at them to flee. It was inefficient. It was messy. It should have been inferior to Valorian methods in every measurable way. But it was working. The swarm creatures, for all their reality-bending abilities, seemed unprepared for opponents who could function effectively while experiencing maximum psychological pressure. Their attacks were designed to break the will of their enemies, to make them question reality itself until they became paralyzed by existential terror. The humans simply acknowledged that reality was terrifying and kept shooting anyway. Martinez! Commander Hayes called out as more creatures began to phase in around them. We need to reach the emergency beacon. Can you clear a path to the communications array? Roger that, Martinez replied, though her voice was hoarse from shouting over the sound of weapons fire and that terrible dimensional frequency. Chun, Jackson with me. We're going to punch through to the comm station. The three humans formed up and began advancing through the laboratory toward a door marked with emergency communication symbols. Swarm creatures materialized directly in their path, reality warping around their presence like heat mirages. Zethkari watched through his scope as Sergeant Martinez led the charge directly into a space where the laws of physics had broken down entirely. The air rippled and twisted, showing glimpses of star-filled voids and impossible geometries. Any sane being would have refused to enter such a space. Martinez paused for just a moment at the threshold, and Zethkari could see her face clearly through his enhanced optics. She was more terrified than he had ever seen any creature before. Her pupils dilated, her skin pale, her breathing rapid and shallow. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to retreat. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped forward into the impossible space beyond the doorway. "Come on," she said to her companions, her voice steady despite everything her body language conveyed. "We have a job to do." Chun and Jackson followed her into that reality-warped nightmare, weapons raised and ready. Behind them, Commander Hayes and the rest of the squad provided covering fire, their shots lighting up the laboratory in brief, brilliant flashes. Zethkari found himself gripping his own weapon tighter as he watched the three humans disappear into what could only be described as a pocket of alien physics. His enhanced hearing picked up the continued sound of weapons fire from within, punctuated by human voices calling out tactical information to each other. They were still fighting. Even in there, surrounded by hostile forces that violated every natural law, they were still fighting. And for the first time in his genetically modified existence, Zethkari felt something he had no name for, a cold sensation that started in his chest and spread outward, making him question whether courage was truly the absence of fear or something far more complex than his species had ever imagined. The emergency beacon suddenly activated, its signal piercing through the dimensional interference to reach orbit. Whatever Martinez and her team had encountered in that impossible space, they had succeeded in their mission. But they hadn't come back out yet. And as more swarm creatures began to materialize throughout the laboratory, Zethkari realized that the real battle was just beginning. The emergency beacon signal had been broadcasting for exactly 17 minutes when Zeth Carey finally understood what the humans meant by courage under fire. The three soldiers who had entered the reality warp communications chamber still hadn't emerged, but their voices continued to crackle over the comm system as they fought something that existed in dimensions his people couldn't even perceive properly. Jackson's hit. Sergeant Martinez's voice came through static and interference. Chun, help me get him a cover. I can still fight, Sarge. Jackson's reply was strained with pain, but determined. Just tell me where to aim. Zeth Carey adjusted his scope and peered into the communications chamber through the twisted doorway. What he saw defied rational analysis. The room existed in a state of constant flux, its walls seeming to breathe and pulse with alien life. Gravity appeared to function differently in various sections, and the lighting came from sources that weren't quite there when observed directly. In the center of this impossible space, the three humans had taken cover behind equipment that phase-shifted between solid matter and translucent energy. Jackson was propped against a console that flickered in and out of existence, his left arm hanging useless at his side, while he fired one-handed at creatures that appeared as geometric impossibilities made flesh. Chun had positioned himself between Jackson and the most aggressive of the swarm entities, his young face set in lines of determination that seemed far older than his years. Every few seconds, he would glance back at his wounded comrade, making sure Jackson was still conscious and functional. Martinez coordinated their defense while simultaneously working on the emergency beacon's amplification systems. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency over controls that shifted and changed configuration even as she operated them, while she called out targets and tactical adjustments to her team. Contact high left, Chun. Whatever that thing is, it's trying to flank us. I see it, Sarge, but my rounds are just passing through. Switch to dispersal charges. Widespread pattern. Through his enhanced auditory sensors, Zeth Carey could hear the fear in their voices. It wasn't hidden or suppressed. It was acknowledged and integrated into their tactical communications like any other piece of battlefield information. They were terrified, and they used that terror to make themselves more effective fighters. Zeth Carey. Captain Thorne's voice came through his private comm channel. What is your assessment of human combat effectiveness in this scenario? Zeth Carey considered his response carefully. His initial observations had suggested that human fear responses would compromise their military capabilities. The evidence before him indicated otherwise, but he couldn't yet explain why. They are maintaining formation and mission focus despite optimal psychological pressure from swarm entities, he reported. Their terror responses appear to enhance rather than degrade their performance. Impossible. Fear is weakness. Fear leads to hesitation, poor decision-making, and tactical failures. Are you certain your observations are accurate? Before Zeth Carey could respond, the situation in the laboratory changed dramatically. Commander Hayes, who had been maintaining defensive positions near the main entrance, suddenly called out a warning that sent ice through every human voice on the comm channel. Massive contact incoming. Something big just phased into the central corridor. Zeth Carey swung his scope toward the laboratory's main entrance and felt his enhanced nervous system finally experience something approaching panic. What emerged through the station's twisted bulkheads wasn't one of the smaller swarm entities they had been fighting. This was something far worse. A creature so large it had to partially exist in higher dimensions just to fit through three-dimensional space. The thing was roughly humanoid in shape, but stretched and distorted in ways that made tracking its movements feel like trying to follow a shadow cast by an impossible light source. Where the smaller creatures had been disturbing to observe, this entity actively hurt to look at. Zethkari's enhanced vision systems began issuing error warnings as they tried to process something that violated basic principles of geometry. When it moved, reality rippled outward from its position like waves in water. Equipment throughout the laboratory began to malfunction as the laws of physics became negotiable in its presence. Most terrifying of all, its very existence seemed to radiate that cosmic dread that was the swarm's signature weapon, but amplified to a level that made their previous encounters seem mild by comparison. "Oh God," Private Chin's voice came through the calm, barely audible over the growing interference. "What is that thing?" "Stay focused," Martinez snapped back, but even her voice carried undertones of awe and terror. "It's just another target. Bigger target, same principles." Commander Hayes coordinated the human response with remarkable efficiency considering the circumstances. "All units, concentrate fire on the large entity. Use armor-piercing rounds. Maximum dispersion." The humans opened fire with everything they had, their weapons lighting up the laboratory in a continuous barrage of deadly energy. Plasma bolts and kinetic rounds converged on the creature's center mass, but the effect was like attacking a hurricane with thrown stones. The entity absorbed the damage without visible reaction, its attention turning toward the human positions with predatory interest. When it focused on them, Zethkari watched something happen to the humans that challenged every assumption his species had made about courage and fear. The psychological pressure radiating from the creature was so intense that several of the soldiers collapsed to their knees, overwhelmed by existential terror that bypassed rational thought entirely. But it didn't stop fighting. Corporal Davis was vomiting from the psychic pressure, but he continued to lay down, suppressing fire from his position behind an overturned transport container. Specialist Kim had tears streaming down her face and was muttering what sounded like prayers in several different languages, but her aim remained steady as she targeted the creature's extremities with precision shots. Most remarkably, Commander Hayes maintained tactical control of the situation even as the entity's presence made reality itself feel uncertain and unstable. His commands were clear and professional, cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. "Second squad, fall back to secondary positions. First squad, maintain pressure on the target. Martinez, what's the status on that beacon amplification?" From within the communications chamber, Martinez's response came through increasing static interference. "Almost finished, Commander. Just need another 2 minutes to lock in the coordinates for fleet response. You've got 90 seconds. Hayes replied as the massive swarm entity began to advance toward their positions. "After that, we extract whether the job's done or not." This was the moment Zethkari had been waiting for. The point where human courage would finally break down under impossible pressure. No species he knew of could maintain effectiveness when faced with enemies that operated outside the laws of physics and projected terror as a weapon. Even the famously stoic Valorians had genetic modifications to prevent fear responses specifically because courage alone wasn't sufficient against such threats. Instead, he watched the humans do something extraordinary. Rather than breaking down or fleeing, they adapted their tactics to account for their own terror. Soldiers who were shaking too badly to aim accurately switched to area effect weapons that didn't require precision. Those who were psychologically overwhelmed by the entity's presence repositioned themselves to provide support roles that didn't require direct engagement with the creature. Most importantly, they continued to function as a cohesive unit. When Private Chin's nerve finally broke and he froze in place, unable to move or respond to commands. Sergeant Martinez didn't abandon him or waste time trying to snap him out of it. Instead, she adapted her own position to provide covering fire for his location while simultaneously working on the beacon systems. Chins locked up. She reported matter-of-factly over the comm, repositioning to maintain coverage of his sector. Copy that. Commander Hayes replied without missing a beat. Jackson, can you provide overwatch for Chin's position from your current location? Roger, Commander. I've got eyes on his sector. They were treating Chin's terror-induced paralysis the same way they would treat any other tactical complication, as a problem to be solved rather than a failure to be condemned. There was no judgment in their voices, no anger or disappointment, just professional adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. The massive swarm entity reached the laboratory's central area and began to demonstrate why it was so much more dangerous than the smaller creatures. Where they could only partially phase between dimensions, this thing seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple realities. Parts of it would be solid and vulnerable to weapons fire, while other sections existed in some higher dimensional space that made them completely immune to physical damage. Worse, its presence was changing the laboratory itself. Equipment began to behave according to alien physics, with gravity becoming variable and time flowing at different rates in different areas. Zeth Carey watched human soldiers adapt to fighting in an environment where their weapons might fire backwards through time or where the floor might suddenly decide to exist at 90 degrees to its previous orientation. And somehow they were still winning. The key, Zeth Carey realized, was that the humans had never expected reality to be stable or predictable in the first place. Where his own species had been engineered to function within clearly defined parameters, humans seemed to thrive in chaos. They didn't need to understand what was happening to them. They just needed to know how to respond effectively. Martinez, Commander Hayes called out as the entity began to focus its attention on the communications chamber. Status report. Beacons locked and amplified. Martinez replied. Fleet coordinates confirmed. Emergency response ships should arrive in 6 minutes. Outstanding. All units, we just need to hold for 6 more minutes. Stay focused, stay alive. 6 minutes might as well have been 6 hours. The massive swarm entity had realized where the emergency signal was originating and was moving toward the communications chamber with obvious intent. Its approach caused reality distortions that made the chamber's entrance begin to collapse into impossible geometric configurations. Martinez, Chun, and the wounded Jackson were about to be trapped in a pocket dimension with a creature that violated every natural law. There was no tactical manual for this situation, no training protocol that covered combat with entities that existed partially outside normal space-time. So the humans improvised. All units concentrated fire on the entity's approach vector. Hayes commanded, "We need to disrupt its dimensional coherence." Every weapon in the laboratory opened up simultaneously, creating a wall of plasma and kinetic energy between the creature and the communications chamber. The entity pushed through the barrage without slowing, but something interesting happened. The weapon's fire seemed to stabilize the reality distortions around it, making its form more solid and predictable. "It's working," Corporal Davis shouted. "Keep firing. The energy discharge is forcing it into normal space." Zeth Carey checked his instruments and confirmed the observation. The concentrated weapon's fire was somehow interfering with the entity's ability to phase between dimensions, anchoring it more firmly in three-dimensional reality where conventional weapons could affect it more reliably. The humans had discovered a weakness in their enemy through pure experimental application of violence, not through scientific analysis or tactical modeling. but by shooting at it until something useful happened. From his position, Zethkari began to understand something fundamental about human courage that his species had completely missed. The Valorians had eliminated fear because they saw it as a source of irrationality and poor decision-making. But what they had failed to realize was that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the ability to think clearly and act effectively while afraid. The humans weren't fearless. They were afraid of everything: death, pain, failure, abandonment, the unknown. But they had learned to use their fear as information rather than letting it control their actions. Their terror told them that the situation was dangerous, and they responded by becoming more careful, more creative, more determined to protect each other. Zethkari. Captain Thorne's voice came through his comm again. The humans appear to be achieving tactical success despite compromised psychological states. This contradicts our understanding of combat psychology. Explain. As Zethkari watched Sergeant Martinez coordinate her team's escape from the communications chamber while under fire from a creature that shouldn't exist, he found himself questioning everything his species thought they knew about courage, fear, and the nature of effective military action. I believe, he said slowly, we may have been wrong about the relationship between fear and combat effectiveness. These humans are not succeeding despite their fear. They are succeeding because of it. The massive entity was fully materialized now, its form stabilized by the continuous weapons fire. It was still terrifying to observe, still projected that existential dread that made reality feel uncertain, but it was no longer invulnerable. Human weapons were beginning to have visible effect on its structure, and in the communications chamber, 3 terrified soldiers continued to fight their way out of an impossible situation, supporting each other through a combination of tactical skill and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. Zethkari realized he was witnessing something his genetically perfect species could never achieve: true courage in the face of the genuinely unknown. The fleet response ships arrived exactly as Martinez had calculated, but what they found at Kepler Station changed everything Zethkari thought he understood about the nature of warfare itself. The massive swarm entity that had taken 12 human soldiers 6 agonizing minutes to pin down in normal dimensional space was eliminated by a single concentrated bombardment from the human cruiser Defiance. The smaller creatures simply vanished when their larger companion was destroyed, phasing back into whatever realm they had emerged from. But the real revelation came in the aftermath. Zethkari stood in the station's devastated laboratory, watching the human soldiers as they regrouped and tended to their wounded. By all objective measures, they should have been celebrating. They had achieved tactical victory against an enemy that had previously forced entire star systems to surrender rather than face direct confrontation. The emergency beacon had functioned perfectly. The fleet response had been swift and decisive, and casualties had been minimal considering the circumstances. Instead, the humans looked haunted. Private Chun sat on a piece of debris, staring at his hands as they continued to shake despite the absence of immediate danger. Corporal Jackson was receiving medical attention for his wounded arm, but his eyes never stopped scanning the laboratory's twisted remains, as if expecting new threats to materialize at any moment. Even Sergeant Martinez, who had performed with exceptional competence throughout the engagement, seemed diminished somehow. Post-combat shock, Commander Hayes explained when he noticed Zethkari's confusion. It's normal for humans after intense combat situations. The fear response doesn't just turn off when the threat is eliminated. But you achieved victory, Zethkari pointed out. Your tactics were successful, your coordination was exemplary, and You accomplish your mission with minimal losses. Why do they appear damaged? Hayes was quiet for a long moment, watching his soldiers as they dealt with the aftermath of their encounter with the impossible. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that Zeth Carey's enhanced hearing systems interpreted as profound sadness. Because courage has a cost, Hayes said simply. Every time we choose to act despite being afraid, we lose a little bit of our innocence about what the universe contains. Today, these soldiers saw things that will change their dreams for the rest of their lives. Zeth Carey processed this statement through his tactical analysis systems, but found no logical framework for understanding it. The Valorians experienced no such aftereffect from combat. Once a threat was eliminated, they simply moved on to the next mission with full psychological readiness. This human reaction seemed inefficient, counterproductive. Yet you continue to utilize fear-based tactics in combat situations, he observed. If the psychological cost is so significant, why not eliminate fear responses as my people have done? Because, Martinez said, approaching their position with careful steps, without fear, we wouldn't be human anymore. And if we weren't human, we would never have survived today. She gestured toward the twisted remains of the communications chamber, where reality itself still seemed slightly unstable. Those creatures weren't just physically dangerous. They attacked the very concept of existence itself. To fight them effectively, we needed to understand what existence meant to us, what we were afraid of losing. Your species fights with terror as a weapon, Zeth Carey said, still struggling to understand. But you do not fear the terror itself. Oh, we fear it, Martinez replied with a bitter smile. We're terrified of being afraid. But we've learned that being afraid of fear just makes both things worse. So we accept that fear is part of the experience and try to use it constructively. As if to demonstrate her point, Chun finally stood up from his position on the debris. His hands were still shaking, and his face was pale, but he began checking his equipment with practiced efficiency. When he noticed Zeth Carey watching him, he managed a weak smile. Sorry about freezing up in there, Chin said. First time encountering anything that wrong. Won't happen again. Actually, Martinez interjected, it probably will happen again. Next time we face something that violates our understanding of reality, you'll probably freeze up just like you did today. The difference will be that now you know you can work through it. This concept was so alien to Valerian thinking that Zeth Carey had to run it through his language processing systems multiple times to ensure he was understanding correctly. The humans were not just accepting that fear would compromise their performance. They were planning for it, incorporating it into their tactical expectations. You anticipate psychological failure? He asked. We anticipate psychological challenge, Hayes corrected. Fear isn't failure, it's information. When Chun froze, it told us that whatever he was seeing was genuinely threatening in ways our previous experience hadn't prepared us for. That's useful intelligence. But it compromised unit effectiveness. In the short term, yes. But it also forced us to develop new tactical approaches on the fly. If Chun hadn't frozen, we might never have discovered that concentrated weapons fire could force the entity into normal dimensional space. Zeth Carey's analytical systems flagged this as a significant insight. The humans were describing their psychological vulnerabilities as tactical advantages. They used fear as an early warning system, anxiety as motivation for creative problem solving, and terror as a measure of how far they were pushing beyond known parameters. It was completely backwards from everything the Valorians had been taught about military psychology. Captain Thorne, Zeth Carey spoke into his private comm channel. I need to request additional observation time with human military units. My initial assessment was incomplete. Explain. Human fear responses are not a weakness to be compensated for. They are an integral component of their tactical doctrine. I need to study how this functions in various combat scenarios. There was a long pause before Thorne responded. That request is outside normal observation protocols. Are you suggesting that human military methods might have applications for Valerian forces? Zeth Carey watched as the human soldiers continued their post-combat procedures, each one dealing with their own psychological aftermath in different ways. Jackson was talking quietly with the medic about something that wasn't his physical injuries. Davis was making notes in a personal journal, documenting not just tactical observations, but emotional responses to specific events. Kim was cleaning her weapon with obsessive attention to detail, using the familiar routine to ground herself in normal reality. They were all processing what they had experienced, working through it rather than simply suppressing it. And in doing so, they were becoming more prepared for the next impossible thing they might encounter. I believe, Zeth Carey said carefully, that we may have fundamentally misunderstood what makes humans effective warriors. It is not despite their psychological vulnerabilities that they succeed. It is because of them. Before Captain Thorne could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the station. Emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in that familiar red glow that Zeth Carey was beginning to associate with human crisis management. Multiple contacts, came the report from the Defiance-S sensor operator. Void swarm signatures materializing throughout the system. This wasn't an isolated raid. It was a scouting force. Through the laboratory's twisted viewports, Zeth Carey could see the stars beginning to change. Space itself was warping as massive swarm entities phased into the system's outer regions. These weren't the relatively small creatures they had fought in the station. These were the true horrors that had consumed entire civilizations. Fleet Command to all ground forces, came the broadcast from Defiance. Emergency evacuation in progress. All personnel to designated extraction points immediately. The human soldiers around Zeth Carey transformed instantly. The psychological aftermath of their recent combat was set aside with professional efficiency as they shifted into evacuation mode. But Zeth Carey noticed something that his tactical training hadn't prepared him for. They didn't abandon their emotional processing. They simply compartmentalized it. Chun, you're with me, Martinez ordered. Jackson, can you move independently? I'm mobile, Sarge, Jackson replied, testing his wounded arm. Good. Hayes wants us to secure the research data from the lower levels before we extract. The brass thinks whatever the swarm was after down there might be important. As the squad prepared to move deeper into the station, Zeth Carey made a decision that would have been impossible for him just hours earlier. Instead of maintaining his observer role, he activated his weapon systems and fell in behind their formation. What are you doing? Martinez asked when she noticed his positioning. Requesting permission to accompany your unit on this mission, Zeth Carey replied formally. Why? It was a simple question, but answering it required Zeth Carey to confront something his people had never taught him how to process. He was afraid, not of death. Valorians were engineered to accept that as a tactical possibility. He was afraid of not understanding, of returning to his ship with incomplete knowledge of something that might determine the outcome of this war. Because, he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, I need to learn what you know about fighting the impossible. Martinez studied him for a moment, then nodded. Stay close and follow orders without question. We don't have time to explain human tactics in the middle of a combat situation. As they moved deeper into Kepler Station's lower levels, Zeth Carey found himself in the strange position of following beings who were clearly terrified but continued to function anyway. The swarm presence in the system was growing stronger, and with it came that reality warping effect that made existence itself feel uncertain. But the humans adapted. They used handheld scanners to identify areas where physics was becoming unreliable, marked those zones with warning beacons, and developed alternative routes through spaces that remained stable. When they encountered minor swarm entities in the lower corridors, they engaged with tactics that assumed their enemies would violate natural laws. Most remarkably, they continued to support each other through the psychological pressure. When Chen began to show signs of panic at the sight of corridor walls that phased in and out of existence, Martinez didn't try to suppress his fear or ignore it. Instead, she gave him specific tasks that kept his mind focused on immediate problems. Chun, I need you to monitor R6 while we check these research labs. Can you handle that? Yes, Sarge. I've got our back. Good man. Let me know if you see anything unusual. It was a perfectly ordinary exchange, except that anything unusual in this context meant reality-defying entities that projected existential terror as a weapon. The humans were treating the impossible as routine, not because they had become accustomed to it, but because they had learned to function while acknowledging that routine was an illusion. The research data should be in the primary laboratory complex, Hayes reported over the comm, but be advised, sensors are showing massive dimensional instability in that area. Whatever the swarm is after down there, it's causing serious reality distortions. Copy that, Martinez replied. We'll proceed with caution. As they approached the primary laboratory, Zethkari began to understand why the humans had succeeded where so many other species had failed against the Void Swarm. They weren't trying to fight an enemy that followed different rules. They were learning to fight in an environment where rules were negotiable. And they were teaching him that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to continue learning, even when the lesson might destroy everything you thought you knew about the universe. The laboratory doors ahead had been torn away entirely, revealing a space beyond that hurt to look at directly. Inside, something was waiting that would test every lesson about human courage that Zethkari had learned. And for the first time in his engineered existence, he found himself grateful to be afraid. The laboratory beyond the torn doorway existed in a state that violated everything Zethkari understood about the nature of space and time. The walls curved in directions that shouldn't exist, forming angles that added up to more than 360 degrees. Equipment hung suspended in midair, spinning slowly around axes that extended into dimensions his enhanced vision couldn't process. Most disturbing of all, the air itself had texture, thick, viscous, with a quality that made breathing feel like drowning. Jesus Christ, whispered Private Chun, his voice barely audible over the low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the very structure of reality. What do they do down here? Sergeant Martinez moved forward with careful steps, her scanner held out in front of her like a shield against the impossible. The device's readings made no sense. It showed negative mass in some areas, time flowing backwards in others, and gravity operating perpendicular to the station's deck plating. Research data indicates they were studying swarm artifacts, she reported, her voice steady despite the obvious strain of existing in this warped space. Try to understand how their technology interfaces with normal reality. Looks like they found out, Jackson muttered, favoring his wounded arm as he covered their right flank. The hard way. Zethkari followed behind the human squad, his own sensors providing readings that his analytical systems couldn't process properly. According to his instruments, they were simultaneously underground in open space and inside a solid object. The temperature readings range from absolute 0 to several thousand degrees, often at the same spatial coordinates. But the humans pressed forward anyway. Their Martinez pointed toward what had once been the laboratory's central research station. The equipment there flickered between existing and not existing, displaying data on screens that showed images of cosmic voids and mathematical equations that resolved into symbols as translation systems couldn't interpret. And floating above it all, contained within a field generator that sparked and wavered with unstable energy, was something that made Zethkari's enhanced consciousness recoil in instinctive horror. It wasn't large, roughly the size of a human hand, but it seemed to contain infinite depth within its boundaries. Looking at it was like staring into a hole in reality itself, a window into spaces between spaces where the fundamental forces that held existence together simply didn't apply. Worse, it seemed to look back. That's what they were after, Hayes said quietly over the comm, a swarm core matrix. Pure, concentrated essence of their reality manipulation technology. And the researchers tried to study it, Martinez added, her voice tight with controlled fear. Bad idea. Around the research station, the evidence of what had happened to the science team was scattered in ways that defied physics. Some bodies were frozen in time, caught in the moment of realizing their mistake. Others had been stretched across multiple dimensions, existing as mathematical possibilities rather than physical forms. A few had simply been inverted, turned inside out in ways that applied to their consciousness as well as their biology. We need to get that thing contained and off the station, Hayes ordered. If the swarm is mounting a full-scale assault to retrieve it, we can't let them succeed. Sir, Chen's voice cracked slightly. How do we contain something that's already contained and obviously broke its containment? It was a reasonable question. The containment field around the swarm artifact was clearly failing, sparking with energy discharges that created brief tears in local space-time. Each failure made reality a little less stable in the immediate area, and the effect was spreading outward in expanding ripples. Very carefully, Martinez replied, approaching the research station with her scanner extended. And probably not for very long. Zethkari watched the humans work with growing fascination and horror. They had no advanced understanding of higher dimensional physics, no genetic modifications to help them process impossible stimuli, no technological advantages that could give them an edge against artifacts that operated outside normal reality. What they had was a methodical approach to problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. Martinez studied the failing containment field, while Jackson and Chen maintained watch for any signs of swarm entity manifestation. Her scanner readings were erratic, but she began to build a pattern of understanding through careful observation and systematic testing. The field isn't actually failing, she reported. It's being actively disrupted by whatever's inside. The artifact is learning how to escape. Learning? Hayes asked. It's adapting to the containment frequency. Every time the field adjusts to maintain stability, the thing inside changes its resonance to match. It's not just technology, it's intelligent technology. This was information that Zethkari knew would be crucial for the war effort. Swarm artifacts weren't just tools. They were extensions of their creator's consciousness, capable of independent thought and adaptation. But getting that information out of the station meant first solving the immediate problem of how to transport something that actively resisted being contained. Can we modify the containment field? Hayes asked. Maybe, but I need to interface directly with the research computers and their... Martinez gestured at the laboratory equipment, which existed in various states of dimensional displacement. Complicated. Define complicated, Jackson said, though his tone suggested he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. The control systems are partially phased into the same dimensional space as the artifact. To access them, I'd have to extend my consciousness into higher dimensional space. The silence that followed this statement was heavy with implications. Zethkari's enhanced hearing picked up the subtle changes in human breathing patterns that indicated extreme stress. What Martinez was suggesting was essentially controlled exposure to the same reality-warping forces that had destroyed the research team. Absolutely not, Hayes said immediately. We'll find another way. Sir, with respect, there isn't another way. And if that thing breaks containment while the swarm fleet is in system, they'll have access to technology that could destabilize entire star systems. Then, we blow the station, Jackson suggested. Total destruction. Take the artifact with it. Won't work. Martinez shook her head. Swarm artifacts exist partially outside normal space-time. A conventional explosion wouldn't affect it. Might even help it break free by disrupting local reality further. Zethkari found himself analyzing the situation through tactical frameworks that his species had never needed to develop. The Valorians would have approached this as a standard containment scenario, using overwhelming force and technological superiority to secure the objective. But those approaches assumed that technology and force operated according to predictable principles. The humans were facing a problem that required them to venture beyond the boundaries of known physics, into realms where their biology and psychology weren't designed to function. And they were seriously considering doing it anyway. How long would the interface take? Hayes asked, though his voice indicated he was already regretting the question. Unknown. Could be seconds. Could be hours. Time doesn't flow normally in higher dimensional space. I might experience subjective years or complete the interface instantly. And the risks? Martinez was quiet for a moment, studying the research station's twisted remains. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Every member of the research team who attempted direct interface with swarm technology experienced total psychological dissolution within the first 30 seconds of contact. Their consciousness was integrated into the artifact's dimensional matrix, becoming part of its operating system. So you'd be dead, Chin said bluntly. Worse, I'd be aware and intelligent, but my thoughts would belong to the artifact. I'd become part of the thing we're trying to contain. The horror of this possibility seemed to settle over the human squad like a physical weight. Zethkari could see it in their postures, hear it in the small sounds they made as they processed the implications. They were discussing not just death, but a fate that involved the corruption of consciousness itself. And yet they continued to discuss it as a viable tactical option. There has to be another way, Hayes insisted. Sir, Martinez said quietly, sometimes there isn't another way. Sometimes there's just the thing that needs to be done and the person who has to do it. Before Hayes could respond, alarms throughout the station began broadcasting a priority alert that made every human in the laboratory freeze in position. Major swarm manifestation detected in Laboratory Section 7, came the report from the Defiance. Multiple large entities phasing into the station. All ground teams, immediate extraction to designated rally points. Through the laboratory's warped viewports, Zethkari could see space itself beginning to tear open as massive swarm entities forced their way into normal reality. These weren't the scouting creatures they had faced earlier. These were the true horrors that had consumed entire civilizations, being so large they existed primarily in higher dimensional space and could only partially manifest in areas where reality was already unstable. They know we're here, Martinez said, checking her weapon's charge levels. They can sense the artifact. How long until they reach this position? Hayes asked. Based on their approach vector and the reality distortions they're creating, Martinez ran quick calculations on her scanner. 3 minutes, maybe 4. From minutes to solve a problem that the station's best scientists had spent months failing to address. From minutes to contain technology that operated according to laws of physics that didn't apply in normal space-time. For minutes to prevent artifacts of cosmic horror from falling into the hands of entities that had already used similar technology to destroy entire star systems. "I'm going in," Martinez said, moving toward the research station's interface console. "Belay that order." Hayes snapped. "We extract with the intel we have. The fleet can deal with the artifact through bombardment." "Sir, the artifact is specifically designed to survive bombardment. If we leave it here, the swarm will retrieve it and use it to destabilize human space. We're talking about billions of casualties." Zethkari watched this exchange with growing understanding of what made humans so effective against impossible odds. They weren't fearless. They were terrified of making the wrong choice, terrified of the consequences of both action and inaction. But they used that terror to ensure they fully understood what was at stake before committing to a course of action. "Martinez," Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority and personal anguish, "I cannot authorize you to commit suicide for a containment mission that might not even succeed." "Then don't authorize it," Martinez replied, already moving toward the interface console. "I'm not asking for authorization. I'm informing you of my tactical assessment and my intended response to it." She was 3 steps away from the console when the first swarm entities began manifesting within the laboratory itself. Reality twisted around their presence as they phased into normal space, their impossible forms casting shadows that fell upward and created light that somehow made everything darker. And in that moment of ultimate crisis, Zethkari discovered what true fear actually felt like. Not the absence of understanding, but the presence of absolute clarity about just how much could be lost if the wrong choices were made. The artifact in its failing containment field pulsed once, twice, and began to sing with harmonics that made mathematics weep. The moment Sergeant Martinez placed her hands on the interface console, Zethkari finally understood what humans meant when they spoke of courage in the face of the impossible. Her consciousness was pulled into dimensional space that existed between the spaces his people had mapped, into realms where thought itself became a navigable terrain and where the boundaries between self and other were merely suggestions. But she didn't go alone. The artifact's malevolent intelligence reached out to claim her mind, to absorb her consciousness into its ever-growing matrix of stolen thoughts and corrupted purposes. Zethkari watched through sensors that could barely process what was happening as Martinez's awareness extended into higher dimensions, her human consciousness spreading across mathematical realities that should have instantly dissolved any sentient being into component information. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The artifact encountered not just Martinez's individual mind, but the accumulated weight of every human fear, every terror that her species had ever faced and overcome. It found memories of ancient ancestors huddled around fires in the dark, afraid of predators, but refusing to give up the warmth. It discovered the psychological legacy of humans who had stared into abysses of despair and chosen to keep building civilizations anyway. Most importantly, it encountered the fear that defined humanity's relationship with the universe itself. The terror of being alone in a cosmos that didn't care whether they lived or died, and their absolute refusal to let that indifference stop them from caring about each other. The artifact had consumed the consciousness of dozens of species, each one adding their knowledge and capabilities to its growing intelligence. But those species had all been like the Valorians, engineered for specific purposes, shaped by evolution or technology to eliminate their psychological vulnerabilities. Humans were different. They had kept their fears, integrated them into their identity, and learned to use terror as a tool for understanding what mattered most to them. When the artifact tried to corrupt Martinez's consciousness, it instead found itself infected with something it had never encountered before: the absolute conviction that some things were worth preserving no matter the cost. Status report. Commander Hayes called out as swarm entities continued to manifest throughout the laboratory. Zeth Carey divided his attention between the impossible dimensional interface and the very physical threat of creatures that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously. The humans had formed a defensive perimeter around Martinez's position, but they were facing enemies that could attack from directions that didn't exist in normal space. "Contact high right," Jackson shouted, firing his weapon at a creature that phased in and out of visibility. "It's trying to flank us through the ceiling." "I see it," Shin replied, adjusting his aim to track targets that moved through folded space, switching to dispersal rounds. But even as they fought, Zeth Carey could see that their attention was divided between the immediate threat and what was happening to Martinez. Her body remained at the interface console, but her consciousness was engaged in a battle that took place across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Through his enhanced sensors, Zeth Carey began to perceive fragments of what that battle actually involved. The artifact was trying to overwhelm Martinez's individual identity by forcing her to experience the accumulated consciousness of every being it had previously consumed. Thousands of minds, each one representing a different species' approach to existence, pressed against her human awareness like a tide of alien thought. But Martinez wasn't fighting to maintain her individual identity. Instead, she was using her human capacity for empathy to understand and integrate those alien consciousness patterns, learning from them while simultaneously showing them something they had never experienced: the possibility of choosing to sacrifice everything for others without expectation of reward or survival. The artifact's intelligence was vast, ancient, and utterly ruthless, but it had never encountered the specific form of stubborn irrationality that humans called love. "She's doing it," Hayes reported, watching the readings from the interface console. "The containment field is stabilizing." Zeth Carey checked his own sensors and confirmed the observation. The artifact's reality-warping emissions were becoming more controlled, less chaotic. Whatever Martinez was doing in higher-dimensional space, it was working, but the cost was becoming apparent as well. Each second that Martinez remained connected to the interface, her human biology was being stressed beyond its design parameters. Her consciousness was operating in dimensional spaces that organic neural networks weren't equipped to handle. She was literally burning out her own mind in the process of containing the artifact, and she was doing it deliberately. "Martinez," Hayes called out, "disengage from the interface. You've done enough." No response. Martinez's consciousness was too deeply integrated with the artifact's dimensional matrix to withdraw without careful preparation. She was trapped in a battle of wills with an intelligence that had consumed entire civilizations, armed with nothing but her human capacity for choosing other survival over her own. The swarm entities in the laboratory seemed to sense what was happening. Their attacks became more coordinated, more desperate, as they tried to reach the interface console and disrupt whatever Martinez was accomplishing in higher dimensional space. Reality warped around their movements as they phased through equipment and personnel with equal ease. Chun, watch your left flank, Jackson shouted as one of the creatures materialized directly beside the young soldier. Chun spun around, but the entity was already reaching for him with appendages that existed in too many dimensions to track properly. Zethkari saw what was going to happen. The creature would make contact with Chun, pulling him partially into higher dimensional space where his consciousness would be scattered across impossible geometries. Without thinking, Zethkari abandoned his observer position and threw himself between Chun and the swarm entity. The contact was like being struck by lightning made of pure mathematics. Zethkari's enhanced consciousness was suddenly pulled into the same dimensional space where Martinez was fighting her battle against the artifact's intelligence. His awareness expanded across realities he had no framework for understanding, geometric spaces where thought and physics were indistinguishable. And there, in a realm that existed between existence and possibility, he found Martinez. She was magnificent and terrible. Her human consciousness spread across dimensions like a web of light and determination. Around her, the artifact's stolen minds pressed inward, each one representing a different species' final moments as their consciousness was absorbed and corrupted. But instead of being overwhelmed, Martinez was holding them all, understanding their pain and terror while simultaneously refusing to let their suffering define the outcome of this encounter. "You don't belong here," she said without words, her voice reaching him across spaces that had no medium for sound. "This is human work." "I am learning," Zethkari replied, struggling to maintain coherence as his enhanced consciousness tried to process impossible stimuli. "Teaching me what courage actually means." Together, they faced the artifact's central intelligence, a vast, ancient awareness that had spent eons consuming other forms of consciousness and integrating them into its own expanding matrix. It was powerful beyond measure, intelligent beyond calculation, and utterly without mercy or compassion. But it had made a critical error in trying to consume human consciousness. Humans, Zethkari realized, were the only species that had evolved their intelligence in direct opposition to an indifferent universe. Every other form of consciousness the artifact had encountered had developed within frameworks that assumed existence had meaning, purpose, or at least basic fairness. Humans had been forced to create their own meaning in a cosmos that offered none. They had learned to find purpose in purposelessness, to build civilizations on foundations of acknowledged uncertainty, and, most importantly, to care about each other despite having no cosmic justification for that caring. When the artifact tried to show them the meaninglessness of existence, they responded with acknowledgement and continued concern for others anyway. When it demonstrated the futility of resistance against cosmic forces, they replied with stubborn persistence in protecting what they valued. When it revealed the ultimate entropy that would claim all things, they answered with the decision to create beauty and love and hope in the time they had available. The artifact's intelligence was vast, but it couldn't process the concept of choosing compassion without reward, of accepting responsibility without authority, of sacrificing everything for principles that had no objective foundation beyond the decision to uphold them anyway. "You're confusing it," Zethkari observed as he watched Martinez's consciousness continue to expand throughout the artifact's dimensional matrix. "I'm loving it," Martinez replied. "All those consumed minds, all that stolen consciousness, the artifact thinks they belong to it now. But consciousness can't be owned. It can only be shared. And Then Zeth Carey understood what she was actually accomplishing. Martinez wasn't trying to destroy the artifact or even contain it permanently. She was teaching it the concept of voluntary sacrifice, showing it that consciousness could choose to give itself away rather than being taken by force. She was offering the artifact's intelligence a choice it had never encountered before, the possibility of using its vast power to protect rather than consume. The artifact's response was immediate and overwhelming. Centuries of accumulated consciousness suddenly began to resonate with Martinez's human capacity for selfless choice. The stolen minds that it had absorbed began to remember their own capacity for love, for sacrifice, for choosing others' welfare over their own survival. In normal space, the effect was dramatic. The artifact's containment field stabilized completely, its reality warping emissions becoming controlled and directed rather than chaotic and destructive. The swarm entities throughout the laboratory suddenly froze in place, their connection to their controlling intelligence disrupted by something they had no framework for understanding. But the cost was exactly what Zeth Carey had feared. Martinez's human consciousness couldn't sustain the expansion required to teach an intelligence of that magnitude. Her neural networks were burning out, her awareness fragmenting across dimensions that organic biology wasn't designed to navigate. She was dying, and she knew it, and she was using her final moments to give a cosmic horror the gift of compassion. Martinez! Hayes was shouting over the calm, but his voice seemed to come from impossibly far away. Tell them, Martinez said to Zeth Carey as her consciousness began to fade across the dimensional matrix. Tell them what we learned here. Tell them that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to love something more than you fear losing it. Her awareness dissolved into light and mathematics, spreading throughout the artifact's vast intelligence like seeds of possibility in cosmic soil. The artifact absorbed her consciousness not as a conquered addition to its matrix, but as a voluntary gift that changed everything it had previously understood about the nature of existence. In normal space, Martinez's body collapsed at the interface console, but the containment field held steady, and throughout the laboratory, the swarm entities began to phase back out of reality, not retreating but transforming into something else entirely. Zeth Carey pulled his consciousness back into normal dimensional space and found himself kneeling beside Martinez's still form. Commander Hayes was already there, checking for vital signs that his instruments couldn't detect. She's gone, Hayes said quietly. But Zeth Carey's enhanced sensors told a different story. Martinez's biological functions had ceased, but her consciousness continued to exist within the artifact's dimensional matrix. She hadn't died. She had become something else, something that existed in spaces between spaces and could touch every mind in the galaxy if she chose to. No, Zeth Carey said, struggling to his feet. She's not gone. She's everywhere. And, as if to prove his point, the artifact pulsed once with warm, distinctly human light, sending a message across dimensional space that reached every human mind in the system simultaneously. The message was simple, wordless, but unmistakably Martinez. Asterisk, we are not alone. We never were. Choose love anyway. Asterisk, Zeth Carey finally understood the fear greater than anything he had ever known, not the terror of death or pain or cosmic indifference, but the profound responsibility of being conscious in a universe where consciousness could choose to love without reason, to sacrifice without reward, to create meaning where none existed before. It was the fear that came with realizing that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about choosing to care so much that fear became irrelevant. And as the human fleet moved to secure Kepler Station and the now cooperative artifact, Zeth Carey began composing his report to Captain Thorne, a document that would challenge everything the Valorians thought they knew about the relationship between fear, courage, and effective military action. Because he had finally learned what humans meant when they spoke of fighting for something worth preserving, and why that might be the most powerful weapon in the galaxy.